Welcome to Tell Me Your Story. This is a special edition of Tell Me Your Story. We're new paradigms for a new world, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices. To help make your dreams come true, I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we come your way every Sunday at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., streaming live at those times, as well as 9 a.m. Wednesdays for this special edition of Tell Me Your Story that is, as I was going to say, streamed live at richarddugan.com. Podcasts are at SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry, and many other locations that you folks are reposting our interviews to. Thank you for doing that. We're also on YouTube, where you can listen to and watch these interviews, and I hope that you will, as well as go to our guest's website. We'll be giving that out shortly so that you can continue your evolutionary process, that transformation that we're all working on to make this world a better place for everyone. Also, if you find that these programs are beneficial and they resonate with you and you'd like to support the work that we are doing, we would greatly appreciate that. Financial support is received through a PayPal account I've set up for your security as well as ours, and also would like you to participate in the Decade of Perfect Vision, the 2020s, where we ask you to go within, spend some time listening to that still small voice, and being calm, find that peaceful place, that serene place where you can relax and re-energize, rejuvenate, recharge those batteries, as it were, on a spiritual level, on a metaphysical level, if you will, on a soul level, so that you can enter into the material world, as it were, fully charged and ready to go to take on whatever tasks it is that you feel like you want to take on. I think you're going to enjoy our program today because we're going to go into a time warp of sorts, which I find fascinating. I've always been intrigued by some of the folks that are putting out materials that are intriguing because they are looking back at history and they are basically taking that old adage that if we do not learn from history, we are, and I think the accurate word here is doomed to repeat it. And I think our guest will probably agree with us there. We're going to be talking with the author of a book that's out, The New American Middle Ages. Well, huzzah! Wait a minute, that's after the Middle Ages comes the Renaissance. Then it's huzzah. But we're going to talk with Jenny Graham Scott, Dr. Jenny Graham Scott, who is a sociologist. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. I find this conversation, it's going to be very interesting, especially considering the fact that there are those who are very firm believers in that concept, that if we do not learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it.
I would definitely agree with that. And that's why I think it's important to know what happened in the Middle Ages, because I think we're reliving that time now.
Which is, on the one hand, it's very unfortunate. But if people will just open their eyes and their ears and take a look around, they will see that, you know, you've got the peasants and the serfs and the royalty and all of this kind of stuff. And the separation is getting wider and wider and wider. And people are getting more and more frustrated, even angry, to the point, unfortunately, of violence. We see a lot. I mean, I love watching movies and television programs, short series programs about the Middle Ages. But I also am saddened by the fact that there are only a few individuals, sometimes at the higher echelons, who get it, who get that everybody is a human being and needs to be treated in a certain way. Let's find out why, how, or rather, maybe more so how, not so much why, but we can answer the why also. How did you begin this, how do I say this, investigation or research into acknowledging or recognizing more so that we have entered or are entering or have entered the Middle Ages here in the 21st century?
Well, I think for me, it started by watching a number of programs on Netflix. There were history programs, and they were about the Middle Ages and the way the kings and the royalty had conflicts, and they had the peasants and they had rebellions. And so I started learning about all that, and I just started seeing parallels with what was happening in our life today. and particularly as we have a social inequality that's bigger than ever. And so, the people are living like royalty and they're totally separate. And many of the films, in fact, on Netflix, deal with the problems of the royalty, sort of separating us. We're watching these programs about things that don't really deal with day-to-day life. Foreign films are a little bit more general, where they take into consideration what's happening in everyday life. But more and more, like the Life with the Kardashians, You Want to Be a Millionaire, the Shark programs. I mean, there are just so many programs that emphasize the fact of, well, you too can be a millionaire and maybe somebody can win a lottery. But for most people, there's a growing poverty. In San Francisco, there's this huge homeless problem. And they can't seem to solve it because the people, the NIMBY people, don't want people in their neighborhood who are poor and homeless. And so there's struggles to try to even find places for them to live.
Is that sort of the main problem, if you will, is that there are those who have attained that status, we'll call it that, and maybe they started, because we hear about the rags to riches stories, and that they forget, or is it those who are born into what is referred to privilege, who they don't get it? I heard this about the Kennedy family, for example, and this is going back 10 or 15 years when I heard this, okay, that the reason why, if we took a look at the actions, I mean, all of the actions, even those we aren't even aware of, but we became knowledgeable about some of the carryings on behind the scenes. The Kennedys, for example, that's their norm. But for you and me, we'd have some moral and or ethical problems with some of that behavior. But for them, that's what they were raised in. They don't know any different. Now, this is how it was explained to me. I'm not saying that's the way it is. That was what someone said to me. Or like, for example, what came out in that interview with, what was it, Harry and Meghan, in terms of what really is going on behind the scenes, the attitudes and so forth. And that's just the way they are. It isn't right or wrong. It just is.
Yeah, no, I think it's a totally different lifestyle. And kids that are raised in power, they go to boarding schools, they're totally out of touch. And it was very much like that in the Middle Ages, and as I talk about in the New American Middle Ages, that you had the royalty who was raised by scholars who would come in and they would teach people at the castle or the mansion. And they were totally separate. And there wasn't really the same kind of education that we have today, but in the public school education is very much different than the private school experience that people have. And they learn to become, very exclusive. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager going to a cotillion in Boston, and I had a contact there, and he invited me and a friend. And so we started dancing with some of the people there, and they would say, well, where are you from? And I would say Breakneck High. And all of a sudden they would say, well, thank you very much for the dance. And they would move on because, I wasn't of their class. And my friend had that experience too. And there's a sense of once you are in that class, you want to stay in that class. You want to follow the behaviors. And so you're very ready to ignore or shun other people who aren't, because you're afraid of being pulled back down again. And you see this all the time with people in power. The kids just take it for granted that they're going to have power, but then sometimes they have trouble with drugs and alcohol. They party a lot. They don't really have the kind of job responsibilities because they've been given so much money and power from a young age.
It is really kind of strange because, I sit here and I say, boy, I would really like to have a few more zeros before the decimal point in my bank account. But then there is that other perspective of, yeah, but what would that turn me into? And I have all these wonderful idealistic goals. I want to support this nonprofit and that group of people and so forth. If I just had all of that, coinage and so forth in my bank account, I would do that. And it's idealistic when we start out. And it's almost along the same lines of people who run for public office, especially to Washington, D.C. They're very idealistic when they start out. But when they get to Washington, they say there's like something in the water or something in the air that just turns them into something that they had never wanted to be in the first place.
Sociologists talk about that, or psychologists talk about what's called groupthink. And you become part of this group and you learn to think the way the group works. There were some experiments done by Zimbardo in the early days of people who were kids that were just assigned to be either jailers or prisoners. And then after a few days, the jailers started acting like, real jailers, and they mistreated the kids that they were with. And they had to stop the experiment because it was starting to become very dangerous. And so people are easily swayed into whatever group they're in, of following along the rules. I mean, we're sort of trained to be part of a group.
Is there any part of our society, and I'm going to go global here, that has ever sort of, I don't know if I want to say resolved or come to grips with and maybe corrected for even if it was just for a period of time, that whole social inequity?
I'm not sure there really is. I mean, you have all these revolutions going on all over the world right now because of people in Korea, in Myanmar, in Egypt. I mean, every place you can think of, and several places in Africa, where there's rebellions against people who were once maybe out of power, now they're in power. And there were struggles within royal families in the Middle East, for example. In Jordan, there was this, I think there's an arrest of Hamza, who was the brother, and he was supposedly starting a rebellion. And power can be very, very seductive. And I think you see that in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, it was much more maybe structured. I mean, you didn't have many opportunities for moving ahead. Maybe as if you became a knight, you could, gain power, and some of the knights, or like Rasputin, who becomes, in the court and influences somebody. But with rare exceptions, they were very much organized. And one of the things that inspired the rebellions in the 1400s was all the taxes because they were fighting these wars for territory between these different feudal kingdoms, that they would bring out these armies and they would pay the armies and they would tax the peasants even more. And so that created the rebellions. And then after a while, because of the famine changed everything, because what happened then is you had about a half to a third of the population being decimated. And so suddenly they were paying the people more because there were fewer workers. Mm. That helped to create a middle class, and that helped to pave the way for the Renaissance. And so, in some ways, I mean, I see that these rebellions that are going on, I mean, they're killing huge numbers of people. I mean, I've been reading what's going on in Myanmar, and they were more and more repressive. But, at a certain point, maybe the tide will turn. And I mean, at that point, there's this new generation that emerges.
We're talking with Gini Graham Scott. She is the author of The New American Middle Ages, as we are conversing about our period of transition, if you will. It's been going on for quite a long time. We'll talk a little bit about that as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And we are going to give you the website here in just a moment where you can find out more about the work that she is doing. It is Change Makers Publishing and writing.com. Changemakers Publishing and writing.com. You can find out more about her and the work that she does and the other things that she has written as well. And we'll continue our conversation here with her as we continue with you on Tell Me Your Story. We do give you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true here on the program. And I think that one of the things that we want to talk about now with our special guest, Gini Graham Scott, is something you alluded to right near the end of our last segment, was the fact that following the Middle Ages, not a fun time to be in. And it seems to me that if we had it back then, and what was that, like the 1600s?
what's it, 1400s,
14.
1500s, then everything started changing.
And we went into, I'm curious, have you seen that cycle repeated going back even further, maybe before the beginning of AD? In the BCs, was there the same kind of conflict that we keep doing this as the civilizations grew and grew and grew?
Well, I think there's this pattern. I mean, if you look at the Mayans and the Aztec empires, there were rebellions that went on there against the different groups. And so I think that one of the things that may have contributed to the extinction or the decline of those societies is the fighting that was going on between them. And then there might have been some other factors too, in terms of disease and other reasons for that. Another thing that also can happen is the climate change. And that's one of the things that triggered some of the rebellions, because there was suddenly a coldness, cold front that happened. So the climate was changing then. You also see, I've been doing some research on Neanderthals, and I have another book called The Return of the Neanderthals. It's fiction based on what would happen if Neanderthals came back. But if you look at the extinction of Neanderthal society, there was a cold swap or sweep in Europe around that time. And so they were confined to a smaller area at the same time that the Homo sapiens were coming in. And so they might have had better tools and whatever, and then they mingled with each other. And so you have this mixture. We have about 1 to 4% DNA from the Neanderthals. But you have these extinctions of different groups, and before then there were the Novians, and there are a lot of hominids that they're just only discovering now in the archaeologists and paleontologists. And it's like we go through these cycles, and you can see this in the animal behavior as well, where there's always a struggle for dominance. Who is the top dog? And then as soon as they have some weakness, other animals come up. And so I think it's a pattern in human life.
Well, the one, I guess you could say, upside, in a manner of speaking, is that following these periods, in this case, we refer to it as the Middle Ages. I'm not sure exactly why, because it happened, as you say, 1500s. I don't know if that's because it was between 0 and 2000.
It's called the Dark Ages.
Dark Ages.
That was after Rome declined, and then you had all the tribes fighting, and out of that emerged the Middle Ages. And for a while there were these fights in England or in other parts of Europe, where these different tribes would fight each other, and gradually they coalesced into these empires, the Holy Roman Empire, for example, under Charlemagne. So remembering some of the history that I haven't thought about for a long time, even in writing that book, because my book was focused on starting around the 1400s.
Well, we then entered what is referred to as the Renaissance period, where they say that, for example, the present day situation that we find ourselves in, with not just the virus, but other issues as well, and obviously the turmoil here in the United States, but as you've already mentioned, around the world with revolutions taking place. There are those people on this program who talk about the new Renaissance. They haven't actually used those words, but they've been talking about a new awakening, that people are starting to wake up and see, and so to speak, see what's really going on, and also starting to smell the roses. You've got all of this turmoil and stuff going on, but that isn't going to solve anything, because it never has. It's only perpetuated more unrest from their perspective.
Cycles of that. I mean, like in the 68, there were all these revolutions about Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And then around that time, there was also this New Age movement, and I was part of that too.
Yeah,
people would go into these retreats. I went to Esalen.
I was in LifeSpring.
What?
I was in LifeSpring, which was a spinoff of Est.
Yeah, and so there were all these New Age movements that were part of this transformative movement in psychology. And now we have the happiness movement in psychology, or positive psychology. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I think that's, roots of that. but at the same time, we've become much more materialistic. I mean, there was this time where, people would say, oh, everything can be free and we would just be happiness. And that didn't last very long.
It's very interesting. Go ahead. No, I was going to say, go ahead with what you were saying there.
Well, I was just thinking, with the pandemic and, all of us suddenly, being locked in and having new ways of living without our technology, which we didn't have, 50 years ago, 40 years ago. We couldn't have our conversation now. I mean, people are getting used to talking on Zoom, and there's Blitzer, and there are all of these different movements. There's Bitcoin, and it's coming out to find a way. I mean, there was the GameStop rebellion among some of the stock traders who were rebelling against some of the hedge fund people. And I mean, you see this kind of on all different levels. I mean, it's not just people fighting in the streets,
right?
But there are other people who are trying to use this new technology to create new ways, new grassroots ways of support. And there are also movements now to break up some of the big businesses. I mean, particularly like Amazon has 70% of the market, but they can just almost do anything. I mean, they can just terminate people's accounts for no reason. And people have a little way of fighting back. In fact, I just discovered there's this whole network of lawyers who are fighting to appeals of getting people's accounts reinstated on Amazon. But there are alternatives to that like Ingram Spark and Drafted Digital and Shopify that could be a basis for saying, well, we don't need Amazon anymore. I mean, you've gotten too big. And so there are protests from workers against Amazon. There's protests about trying to break them up from business people. The bookstores hate them because they feel like they're destroying the bookstores. And and now there are politicians that are feeling like, well, it's too big. It's time to bring back the trust busting days.
One of the things I find interesting about that perspective is by people is the one thing that comes to my mind is that Amazon, like all of these other companies that you've referred to, they're all private. They do not have to adhere to certain rules that, say, the public sector or the government has to adhere to, schools have to adhere to, and so forth. And that if you don't like it, and just as you've expressed to the other companies that are out there, if you don't like it, start your own or find another one. That's why when I heard about the whole thing about certain individuals being their accounts being suspended or actually eliminated on, say, Twitter or Facebook, and they want to get back at Facebook and Twitter because of it, I'm going, why? Why don't you just find another platform, or why don't you start your own platform?
I think the problem is that it can be very competitive and hard to do that, if you're just starting out, because of, you get branding and everything, 70% of the market is there. And it takes a certain buildup from many people who suddenly realize that they can do this. And to start this new social media platform, I mean, Facebook has pretty much dominated that space. LinkedIn is more for the business community, but it's much smaller than Facebook. Instagram is basically owned by Facebook. So you have this consolidation. And I think the government is starting under the Democrats to take more steps to try to regulate business. I mean, there used to be antitrust laws that were actively pursued to make sure that companies didn't get too large, because I think what happens then is you get these little fiefdoms or kingdoms that parallels with the Middle Ages. I mean, you had in the Middle Ages, the counterpart was the church. However, the church became so closely intertwined with some of the leaders, like the second son would go to the church, because the inheritance rules, they wouldn't break up the kingdom. So, and the women couldn't inherit anything. And so they were excluded. So, I mean, you didn't have this movement of women in the Middle Ages, obviously, but, you're just starting, in the early 1900s, and with women starting to come into their own. But, one of the problems with our media is it tends to jump from one thing to another, or it emphasizes things to be in the news. Like, and something may not be that important, but the media plays it up. I've been following some of the Republican and anti-POTUS kinds of things that are going on Facebook, and and the struggle with Gates, and so at one time people used to just resign and feel like they've had enough pressure, but now what politicians are doing is they're just staying there, figuring the news cycle will go on to something else and people will forget about them.
Yeah.
And so are maintaining their power, and it's much the same thing that would happen in the Middle Ages, where you would have these kings and nobles who would get into positions of power. There would be coups against them. And so then they would, destroy the coup. They would arrest everybody. They would execute them. They would hang them in the gallows, or whatever method of execution was being done. And so you have the same sort of thing where people, maybe they're not being executed, but they're being silenced. They're taken off Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah. Well, we're talking with Jenny Graham Scott, and we're discussing her latest work and other things as well regarding sociology and what have you. The New American Middle Ages here on Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. And we hope that you will go to her website. And that website that we want you to check out is Changemakers Publishing and Writing. Lots of great stuff there. I've been there. I've looked. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at it right now. You do some consulting. You do a lot of other works there as well. And we encourage people to go there. They can find out about you and many of the other things that you have done. And we're going to continue our conversation here on Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. We're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., streaming live at those times at richarddugan.com, as well as this special edition of Tell Me Your Story, 9 a.m. on Wednesdays. And we podcast at SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, and other locations. And we're also on YouTube. Go to the YouTube channel, look for the guy with the hat, Richard Dugan, and Tell Me Your Story. And Jenny Graham Scott, Dr. Jenny Graham Scott's my guest, and we're talking about the New American Middle Ages. Now, I kind of brought up the aspect of middle. I don't know where middle falls in, but you said, no, this is Dark Ages, another term. So why wasn't the title then maybe the New American Dark Ages? Or was that too pessimistic a title?
Well, I mean, because I took the medieval period that is being called by scholars the Middle Ages. Okay. And so so that's where I started, and I didn't write about the Dark Ages, although that sort of led the way to it, because you had these societies emerging out of the struggles in the Dark Ages, and the Middle Ages became sort of a consolidation of royal power. Is essentially what happened that marked the beginning of the Middle Ages.
Do you see in the present day, here we are in 2021, we're in the 21st century, it ain't the Jetsons like I was hoping for. Geez, where are the flying cars when you need one? Do you see that we might be, maybe kind of in a way, somewhere in some circles, learning from history and are trying not to repeat it, even though when I think about it, and your example of looking at the Middle Ages and the next came the Renaissance, and now we're going to have maybe the same kind of thing happen, maybe by 2025 or 2030, we'll see a modern day Renaissance of art and science and spirituality and so forth. You see any of that anywhere?
I think that could be coming, but I think that, in terms of people studying the Middle Ages, many people today don't have the same kind of interest in education. So you have, many people who are not particularly interested in education. They go on their cell phone and they talk to people on Snapchat. And I mean, there's this downplaying of education today and intellectual things. So you might have a class of people who are leaders in society who are more educated and following this. But you also have this anti-science movement, particularly in the right wing, that has pretty much taken over the Republican Party. And from what I've read now, I've been following the Palmer Report, and they talk about the Republicans now being in tatters because you've got this group that's sort of the anti-intellectual, the science group. Many of them have taken over organized religion or the evangelical movement, and they're all kind of denying science. They're denying climate change. They're denying, many of the people don't want to be vaccinated because they have all these problems with it. And then you have this other side that's more educated, but they're almost afraid to do anything because of the strength of the radical people who are supported by a lot of, maybe people who are not terribly well educated, and you have this rural urban split that's going on now. And I think you could see parallels between, well, they had this educated class in the Middle Ages, but most of the other people, the peasants, were not particularly educated. They were not literate. So that, another parallel I was thinking about is the whole sports phenomena, because we had that in the Middle Ages. We had the knights. At one point, we had the gladiators, in Rome. And in a sense, they picked on lower class people who became like their knights and the fighting. And there was a high death rate for them. I mean, it was a very dangerous kind of thing, but they would celebrate somebody, and it was a chance for rising up. And I think you see the same thing in modern day sports, where you have people who are kind of, taken out of the lower classes, the lower class boxers, and then they suddenly get, power because they are good fighters. But it also is dangerous because of the football they're discovering about the head injuries and creating, mental problems later on. And I'm trying to remember the name, who just recently committed suicide as a result of that, because he had so many mental illnesses, and he killed a couple of people, and he was in jail. And the name is on my top of my head.
I know who you're referring to, though. And it's interesting. I find it very fascinating, the parallels between our past and our present. And I know that for myself as an individual, I take a look at my own personal past, and it's like, I don't want to keep repeating the same old stuff because it's getting kind of boring and I'm tired of it. And yet I'm still kind of trapped in the sense that, well, I haven't quite resolved within myself. It's like, you would think, because you mentioned these personal growth programs back in the 70s and 80s that we've both been through. And you would think that after going through those programs, we would have been freed of all of that baggage, and that we would have gone on to do, incredible things. And I suppose some people might say, hey, you've done some incredible things by the work that you do. And here I am doing this program and sharing these ideas. And yet there are times when, I don't know about you, but I feel like I haven't quite made it. It's like, I'm this close. I'm like right on the edge. And if I could just get over the hump, and I never seem, it's like I get slightly over and I can't kick the other leg over, and then I fall back again. Yeah. And I know that that's kind of how our society kind of looks that way too. And that, it seems like we're almost there. It seems like we're about on the verge, and then something pulls us back. It's kind of like that story of a lobster pot, and you put the lobsters in the pot before you turn the heat on in the water, and they start climbing up on top of one another. And finally, one of them pulls the one that's very at the top, pulls them back down. And it's like, you got to start all over again.
I mean, I've heard that story with frogs too.
Yeah.
But to go back to the New Age movement, I mean, it was really only a small percentage of the population. It got a lot of publicity, but it was essentially middle-class people. And a lot of the people were in California and New York, and, sort of isolated. And so that went on for a while, and it was very exciting. But I don't think it really spread, to middle America very much.
No.
And so and I think today you do have people who are life coaches and people doing workshops and seminars. But I think there's much more focus about doing this self-improvement so you make money, so you achieve goals, so you have a career focus. So it's a little bit more, hard tax right now, in terms of the economy and making money and doing all of this stuff, like the gospel movement, where this, the gospel people are saying, well, you can increase your wealth, through God. But again, it's about, making money, making bucks. There are some people like Warren Buffett who are contributing huge amounts of their money to charities.
Yeah.
The Gates Foundation is another example.
Yeah.
And I think that more and more of that should be encouraged, because when you have so much money focused on the top and you have people on the bottom who are homeless and are about to be evicted because they haven't been able to pay their rent because they've been unemployed. I mean, it creates a major split in society that generates this rebellion, because where else do people go? So I think more and more, if the sort of the modern day royalty can start providing charitable contributions, I mean, I said that would certainly help. I mean, but on a large scale. But that's only a small percentage of these billionaires that have been created.
Exactly.
There was an interesting story about this one billionaire who lost, I don't know, $20 billion in one day.
Wow.
He was sort of playing using, I guess, derivatives and borrowing money, and then some things went down, and I mean, it's just crazy, and a lot of us cannot really understand. I mean, I've read this several times, and the financial system has become so complex now.
It has. I still remember the story of that one sports thing that everyday Americans got involved in, and they actually they learned the rules of the game, and they turned the tables on the people higher up, higher echelon economically, and of course nobody could figure out, well, how did they manage to do that? Well, they finally analyzed how they did it, and they can do it again.
Well, and it's the GameStop people, and maybe people think of BitCurrency as a way of doing that. However, some of the banks are creating these cryptocurrencies themselves. And so, I mean, right now, Bitcoin has, gone up about 10 times.
Oh,
it's just been crazy.
Yeah.
But it also can fall down again. And I mean, there are all these forces that are struggling against it. And I think we've become such a complex society that people can only know what's in their niche.
Yeah.
So a need for us to reach out and connect with different niches.
Yeah. They say what goes up must come down. So keep that in mind if you're investing. Hope you're investing in.
And that's what happened with a lot of the kings. I mean, they would be so powerful that the nobles would fund these coups, and sometimes it worked. And the people would be out of power. They would be executed, or they would execute a younger sibling who might be a threat to them. So, I mean, you have all of this power struggles going on once people get into power, and that's happening today. You see the fights in the Republican Party versus Trump. Trump is McConnell's a supporter, and now he's on the outs with him. And Gates was at one time, a very close associate, and now he's become toxic. And it's sort of like this power balance goes back and forth, and people are trying to figure out who's on top, who to associate with, and it can be very scary.
What I find fascinating as we continue in our program, what I find fascinating on the political level is, depending upon who's on top, when we go into an election, they accuse the one that's on the bottom that if they win, if the people the party that's on the bottom wins, it will destroy America and democracy and the Constitution. And it doesn't matter which side you're on, because somewhere down the road, another 5 or 10 years, then that's going to be said about the other guys. And it just keeps going back and forth, and it doesn't feel like we make progress like we do on this program. Tell me your story, New Paradigms for a New World. Gini Graham Scott, Dr. Gini Graham Scott, and the new American Middle Ages is what we're talking about. I haven't gotten my robes yet. I'm still waiting for my headgear to begin jousting and all that fun stuff. So just to stay in practice. Of course, I do need to get a horse as well, but we will continue our conversation with her as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. And we hope that you will participate in the decade of perfect vision, the 2020s. Spend that time going within, listen to that still small voice, and find that calm, peaceful place. It's a great thing to do, especially if we are just now coming out of being locked down. You're going to need the guidance to move forward and really get focused on your life's purpose. So we hope that you will take advantage of that. Here on Tell Me Your Story, we're talking about the new American Middle Ages with Gini Graham Scott. Dr. Gini Graham Scott, PhD, which I know it's a redundant. I say doctor and PhD. It's one or the other, but nonetheless, your experience, your education and research and study is in sociology. First of all, I love defining terms. I have a general idea of what that means. What is the study of sociology?
Well, it's mainly the study of modern societies. I mean, I also have an MA in anthropology. And at one time, there used to be a lot of these small societies that anthropologists would study. And there's a whole archaeology is also part of the anthropological discipline. And so and then the paleontologists are even, earlier dealing with the bones and DNA and that kind of research. There was a split in terms of anthropology and sociologists. And the anthropologist approach was more like participant observation, which is what I did when I first started in sociology. And I would get involved in various groups, and I got in some spiritual growth groups. I was in a witchcraft group for a while, and I compared that in my dissertation to a spiritual growth group. I'm trying to remember the name of it. And a Wicca group, witchcraft calls Wicca now. And so anyway, I compared these two groups, and the main differences were more in kind of the outer, what they would do out externally, but internally they sort of had the same kinds of approaches. They were very insular. They would take on their particular approach. They would, be down on outsiders. And then within the witchcraft movement, I also studied another group, which I call the Church of Who. It was the Church of Satan, and then it got a split off. And so there were these early groups. This was 1968. And for a while, I dated somebody who was in the spin-off in the Church of Satan. And it turned out he had sort of it was all a PR stunt. He had this wedding, and Anton LaVey was the head at that time. Mm-hmm. So I was involved with that group for a while, and then I wrote about this spin-off group called, I call it the Church of Who, and it had another name in reality. But anyway, it's like all these groups sort of split. You have the leaders who feel like, they have a better way, and they split off from the groups. And it seems like a parallel to what goes on, in all levels of society, and particularly among people who start having money or power.
And I remember in the 80s, there was again, as I mentioned, I worked for a Christian radio station for 15 years, greatest education I was ever paid for. And I learned about sociology, psychology, comparative religions, or sects, if you will, among other things, and a little broadcasting here and there. But there was a Christian comedian who claimed that he used to be a Satanist high priest, and all of his comedy and his whole ministry was based upon that premise, that he had worshiped Satan and on and on. And now he was all for Jesus. And it turns out that it was all a lie. And I thought, did you really think that you could get away with this? And the thing is he was a pretty funny guy. He really was. But it was all based upon a lie.
I've read about some of these cults. Burqa was another one of these where, there's people who follow the cult leaders. I mean, you have many people who really believe, and there were people in the group, both in the Church of Satan and in this offshoot group, who are really believers. But then you can have people who are playing the game because they know that that's going to get them wealth and power and followers. And, and it can be very hard to tell the difference for somebody. And, so you have sometimes these imposters who come into the groups and they investigate, and then they write about them. And so that happened. There was another church group that, I'm trying to remember the name of it, Nivicum, that had this leader who he ended up in jail. And that was also on Netflix. So there are a number of these documentary exposed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my wife and I saw that one. It was really fascinating. I have to tell you that from the moment I saw this guy in the documentary, I'm going, this guy looks creepy. There's something not right. Now he was going after the women. I was perfectly safe for the most part if I was in that group, but he still just looked so creepy.
I mean, he looked like a salesman. I mean, he had such a following of women he would go from one to the other. Yeah. And so that for very powerful men, I mean, they think nothing of it. I mean, it's a double standard for women. I mean, there's some women in power in history who would be able to get away with, and they would take lovers. I mean, Elizabeth, the one did that, and she was sort of known for that. Helen of Troy. I mean, they would take on lovers, and because they were in power, they were exceptions. But there was always the standard of, men can do this, that they're supposed to, and they can be very outward about it. And it's even more so in the Middle East, where you have this super split.
Yeah, well, there's a great line from a Harry Chapin song. My old lady took a young man last night. It drove me crazy when she said, baby, don't you get uptight. Why can't women play the same damn game that men play, basically? I'm paraphrasing there. And I thought, isn't that interesting? If it's high school, if it's the girl who's sleeping around, she's a slut. But if it's a guy who's conquering these women who are supposed sluts, he's some hero of some sort. It's just bizarre. By the way, I just wanted to say, in terms of, you have sociology and anthropology, I have to say that the study paleontology, the study of dinosaurs, that would be a great study in reference to the subject of Congress. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to...
Funny, I did this book on Neanderthals, and
that's even better. That's even better.
I objected to that because the Neanderthals are actually smarter than we think they are. And I mean, they had families, they had very cooperative hunting, they had wore clothing, based on loincloths, and they had, other things that they got from the animals, and the capes. Yeah. And so they did a lot of things that, it was at the time in which they got extinct. I mean, it could have gone either way. I mean, because they were very powerful and strong. And so, they have very strong bodies. They were built for dealing with the cold. And so that's one of the reasons for their large nostrils and their facial structure. And then they have much better vision than us. I mean, there were lots of ways in which they might have endured better than we did. Yeah. But so when Biden used that term, that's example of Neanderthal thinking, and it was picked up a little bit later. I wrote a press release about how I thought that it was misunderstood about the Neanderthals, and I have a little book that I came out with called "Latest Thinking About Neanderthal Thinking."
What about, and I just want to dovetail off of this real quick before we take another pause here, but what about I had to look this up because I kept hearing it over and over again, and I wasn't sure what it meant, and I'd looked it up, and okay, that makes sense. Draconian thinking.
Draconian?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that refers to, but I mean, it sounds like, thinking in a very kind of aggressive way.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, it's rather interesting because when people come up with certain ideas for solutions, someone's, that's just draconian thinking. But we're
clarify something about sociology.
Yes.
Sociology is much more statistically oriented compared to the more anthropological. I mean, they're both very much statistical right now. Mm-hmm. At one time, very few sociologists did participant observation. There was some gang studies early on, but now it's very, very statistical, and criminology especially.
We're talking with Dr. Gini Graham Scott, and she has written a lot of different books and booklets and so forth, and she's got a website that we encourage you to check out as well. The title of the book is, of course, The New American Middle Ages. The website is changemakerspublishingandwriting.com. We will be linked to that website as well so that people can go there and read more about you and the work that you are doing, as well as other materials that are available. And we hope that people will continue to listen to the interviews on our podcast as well as our video cast on YouTube. And this is Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, and I thank you so much for staying with us. I thank you, Jenny, Dr. Gini Graham Scott, for staying with us here on the program as we talk about a lot of these areas. I wanted to go into one area in particular as to what was it that led you to, or drew you, if you will, and we'll go ahead and grab both of these, to both sociology and anthropology, that that drove you? Because I've seen people get their PhDs. I have worked here in Santa Barbara now for 15 years. And with this radio station that I'm working at, I have watched several people, both guests of programs as well as hosts, go after their PhDs. And it's not an easy process. And then they show me their doctorate, the document, I guess, of their PhD. And a master's isn't any easier to get either, I'm sure. So what sent you down this wonderful path as you're able to share with us today?
Well, I've always loved getting education and learning more. And I also have a JD in law. So I went to law school as well. And then I got 5 masters. And finally, I decided to stop about 2 years ago. I was signed up for a history master's. And I was thinking I'd like to write about the Vikings and all these different societies and what we could learn from the different organizations. And at one time I had written about the Mayas and the Incas and the Aztecs. And I thought I would continue that with these other societies that have gone extinct, you know, Babylonia and Assyria and, you know, so on. And so I was signed up for this class. And then I suddenly discovered I had to learn all of this I can't pronounce it properly, but all this historical research before I could even do my work on the Vikings. And so I just said, look, I just don't need this anymore.
Well, let me ask you in terms of history, because obviously you are diving into history in what are our Middle Ages. How are you able to get more than just one side of the story? Because it's usually the victors of any battle or conflict or civilization that write the history. The losers do not usually get to do that. And so we don't really get a full picture of the history of a particular civilization or time and period.
Well, that's true for in the past. I mean, today we have many people, investigative reporters in particular, and authors who are independent authors who are looking at things from another side and they're coming up with new research. I just got this book. I also work as a ghostwriter where I review books, both to write scripts for them, for turning them into films. And I got one today about the real history about the JFK assassination. And, you know, they came up with this being a one-person assassination. But in his research, he said there were really 3 people because they really heard 3 shots from 3 different directions. And they tried to reconcile that so that there would be just one shooter and then put this under the rug. But there was actually a conspiracy according to this theory. And so you have many people who are coming up with alternate versions of history today, which is possible, you know, because there are, you know, so many people are using Google for search and they're finding other articles. I mean, like when I did my research on history and also on the Neanderthals, I would just go and Google search and find articles. I would find books, and there would be much to draw on. Whereas back in the Middle Ages, you know, before the printing press was developed, I mean, you had these people just writing, you know, the people in the churches and the few people who were literate were educated. And so you really did have this people who could provide this alternate view of history.
Well, you know, it is Abraham Lincoln who said you shouldn't trust anything on the internet.
Well, you have to know what to look for. I mean, some things are trustworthy and some things aren't. And it's just like anything that's being published today. And there are these conspiracy theories. I mean, there's still people who believe there were Satanists underneath these pizza parlors killing kids. Yeah. And they've done research, and I mean, there was no basement even.
Yeah, exactly. And now we're getting stories out that it wasn't the Democrats that are involved in that kind of activity. Now, it's only one individual who might very well be a congressman, might very well be a member of the Republican Party. So I'm not saying it's the Republican Party, unlike the accusations back then of it was the entire Democratic Party that was involved in this child killing thing that was going on in the alleged basement. Now, let me ask you again about research and factual information. Have you been able to find sufficient, and it's referred to as primary source information as opposed to secondhand or third hand, that kind of thing?
Well, I'm not able to read Latin or, other languages to be able to go back to, what these things were written in back in the ages, so I mean, I have to rely on scholars and what's accepted knowledge. But it's sort of funny because I did all of this research from all these different sources, and I had one critic of my book who said something about, well, you didn't pick up the renters today, and the renters are being destroyed, and the rent situation has always occurred. But nobody ever talked about that in the books that I read. And it was all of a sudden somebody with this other theory about, oh, we missed the main point,
Yeah. And of course, it's interesting. I mean, if we're, as there are as many critics in the world as there are economists, and in the way of economists, as I loved what Will Rogers said once. He says, you can lay all of the economists end to end and they'll still all point in different directions. I always found that and of course that applies to a lot of different occupations as well, because everybody's got their own perspective. But in some cases, a lot of these people have their own, almost like their own agenda, their own axe to grind, that they've got to, rather than looking at the evidence, they gather up just enough to point a finger, and then they try to make the evidence match the direction their finger is pointing.
Well, there are all these alternate facts or alternate realities that, and sometimes people come to believe in it. So, I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, there's so many different sources of information today, and to be able to sort through and figure out what's true and what's not true. But I mean, I know in the Middle Age research, I read about 20 different books that were published by scholars about that, and about 3 or 4 dozen articles. And the particular issue about the renters, renting today, may be self-destructive, but there are actually people who think that, well, it's better to invest your money in something else than paying rent, or eventually in real estate. So there are people who disagree with that. I mean, but it is true that all these renters who may be thrown out, they don't own property. Whereas if you paid off somebody else's mortgage in your own name, it would be your own property. But I don't think that really relates to the big issue in the Middle Ages, because these people, the peasants, were sort of renters, and they were paying these tithes or fees to the landlords. But nobody mentioned that in the historical records that I'm citing as one of the big issues. I mean, the issues with the taxes, not so much the fact that they were paying rent. And you have also, under the when you have the freedmen after the slaves were freed, they're paying rent. I mean, they were sort of turned into, essentially slaves, wage slaves. But that kind of thing didn't come up in the research that I cited. So, I didn't talk about it in my book. I mean, you could talk about almost anything, but I was citing the, historical research as sources.
Are you, as an individual, set aside the doctorates and the master's degrees and so forth and the JD, are you optimistic about our future as a country, our future as a species on this planet?
I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on people and realizing, what's happened now, and seeing the divisions in our society. And I think the Biden administration is moving in that direction of trying to make a more equal society and trying to do that. But you have all these people on the other side that are fighting him and saying, well, he's not doing anything. He's not doing enough press conferences. He's not talking enough. Well, because, he's not trying to do press conferences that are taking away from legislation. But you have these obstructionists who just simply want to destroy whatever is happening. And I guess it just depends on enough people sort of waking up and realizing, well, climate change is real. I mean, we see what's going on in deserts and the fires in California. So there are all this evidence of it. The polar caps are melting. The polar bears are losing their habitat. The penguins are. So, I mean, there are lots of evidence of that. And then the virus is something that doesn't care about what you believe politically. I mean, it's going to attack anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's what I find interesting too is that everybody seems to think that whatever this current situation is, that it's permanent, and nothing is permanent. Everything is changing. Everything's in motion. and anything could happen at any given moment. To me, when this pandemic, for example, when it started, all I could think of were the opportunities ahead for us, not knowing what they were. No, I'm not a psychic or anything, but I just knew that because we decided to do something different this time, as opposed to the rest of my 60 years on this planet, where I used to think, if they just shut down the airlines when the influenza hit the United States, shut it down for 2 weeks, you know what? You'd stop the transmission, and then we could get on after those 2 weeks. Everybody's going to feel better, and we get back to being a productive society. But I would always hear this comment that, no, you have no idea what that's going to do to our economy. So now I say that, and if someone says that, I says, as compared to the last 14 months, really? I don't think so, Tim.
Like New Zealand, there are some countries that have been much more isolated than others that have been much lower rates. But, as soon as you open up, it starts climbing. So it's balancing where you really need to solve the pandemic before you can really fix the economy, and people are just afraid, even though we're opening it up. Does that mean people are going to go back to stores? I don't think so. It's going to be a while before all that happens. I know for me as a writer, it actually made me more productive because all my meetings got canceled. And so I wasn't going out pitching things, and I got more people wanted ghostwriting done, more people wanted other things being done. So I wrote a whole series of songbooks. I found a collaborator, and so we've got, I have on my channel, if you go to Changemakers Publishing on YouTube or Changemakers Music on YouTube, you'll see about 80 songs that we did. So I did the lyrics and he did the music.
Oh, wow.
So it opened up doors for me to do that. And so I had more time to do writing, and I wrote some other books about how do you turn your book into a film. And Waterside Press is publishing my next book, which is going to be about the what I call the what's your personality type, or what's your dog type. And it's basically comparing people to these 4 different types of dogs. There's the DISC system, the Myers-Briggs system, there's the color profiling system. So if you kind of merge those together and you imagine that for the 4 main types of people, the aggressive kind of person, the social person, the helper, and the researcher that are identified in these other systems. Well, if you imagine these different dogs, and so you relate to, like, the German Shepherd becomes the aggressive type. You could pick any dogs, but I picked very popular dogs. The Pomeranian is the social type. The Golden Retriever is the helper. The Boston Collie is the researcher. Is really a very smart dog. And so it becomes, and we did some workshops on that, and people could really relate to it. So they're going to be publishing that. It's going to come out in about 5 weeks, about, relating to your personality type and helping you better relate to other people by understanding where you're coming from, whether they're coming from. If you're selling to somebody, do you go into details? Do you come on quickly and strongly? Or do you emphasize how this will help people? So it kind of tailors your personality. So I have a wide range of interests. I mean, sometimes people call me sort of a Renaissance woman because I do so many different things.
Yeah, very interesting.
They like people to specialize. They want you to do that one huge book rather than 200 books like I've done.
Yeah, and if I was to go into dentistry, I think I would focus on the front left molar number 6. That'd be my specialty.
I'm going to have to go pretty soon. But
yes. Well, I want to share something real quickly with you and our listeners that a buddy of mine sent me that kind of goes into what you're talking about in terms of some of these tests. And I hope that you enjoy this. Then we're going to wrap things up. I have 3 final questions I'd like to ask you, but get a load of this.
This little bit is about tater people. Didn't know they existed, did you? You probably come up against them a time or two. Some of them can get all gussied up and look quite fetching. Others is right proper, and you wouldn't mind having them as your best friend. I'm going to tell you all about the different types and how to spot them. Some people never seem motivated to participate, but are just content to watch while others do all the work. These is called spectators. Some people never do anything to help, but are real gifted at finding fault with the way others do the work. These is called commentators. Some people is downright bossy and like to tell others what to do, but don't want to get their own hands dirty. These is called dictators. Some people are always looking to cause problems by asking others to agree with them. Is it too hot or too cold, too sour or too sweet? These is called agitators. Then there are those who promise they'll help, but somehow just never get around to doing the promised help. These is called hesitators. Some people put up a front and pretend to be someone they're not. These called imitators. Then there are those who love others and do what they say they will. They's always prepared to stop whatever they's doing and lend a helping hand. They bring real sunshine into the lives of others, and they's called sweet-taters. If and you know any of these sweet-taters, you send this to them here and give them a big hug and a kiss. That's all. See you next time.
My thanks to my buddy Mike O'Connor for that little piece. And I have to tell you, every time I listen to that, it takes me back to when we worked together, but also it lets me know that there are all kinds of people out there, and I'd rather be a sweet tater than anything else. And I think you're a sweet tater too. And I have 3 final questions for you, if I may ask you, and then I'm going to let you go because I know you've got to run. And the first of those 3 questions is, who is Jenny Graham Scott?
Well, I guess I would describe myself as a creative, prolific person who's always been dedicated to doing new things, doing things differently, and then turning things around. So if something bad happens, I try to find, the kind of turning lemons into, into lemonade. So I've always believed in that. In fact, I have a whole film career, which we didn't talk about, which started off with my getting ripped off by a woman. And I met by the people I collaborate with as a result of that. And we now have 14 films. You can go to Changemakers Productions Films to see examples of the films we've done. We have distributors for the 8 completed films we've done.
Wow. All right. Second question is, that's incredible. Yeah, we'll have to have you back to talk about those things. But the second question is, what is it that you hope to or want to achieve through the work that you are doing now?
Well, I hope that it will help people, and it will inspire people, and educate people and inform people. And so, I mean, I guess that you would say that's sort of my mission in life, is to, sort of share information and use various creative media to do it.
And finally, what is your life's purpose?
Well, I think I just mentioned that. I think it's, being creative and, doing more things, exploring new avenues. And I've always been very interested in lots of things and exploring and discovering new ways of doing things. And so I think that that's basically my life purpose. It took me a while to discover that, because doing so many different things, I always felt very scattered. And then I just, realized, well, my main focus is writing and helping other people with with their books and scripts and doing my own projects. And they're all sort of inspired by writing. I've been a game designer, and by, you write rules. Films, I write the script. For books, I write the book. For songs, I write the lyrics. So it's all really focused around writing.
Mm. Well, Dr. Jenny Graham Scott, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's been a great pleasure to chat with you. And yeah, we should have you back again to talk about all of the other endeavors. You're quite a Renaissance person in my book, with all of the diversity of outlets that you have. I'm extremely impressed. That's wonderful. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and hopefully the Renaissance will be coming back.
Well, you'll fit right in, and so will I hope. I thank you again, and I thank you for listening to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to love.